record this in the English version. So if somebody's missing this opportunity, we can share after this meeting the link so people can look at these recording webinars.
And I've now started the English recording.
Hi, y'all. If you're just joining us, you have arrived at the second webinar of the Building Equity in Silicon Valley's Food System series, and we're going to wait just a couple of minutes as people join, and then we'll get started.
So Laura, what are the main topics for today? Can you give us any heads up, or is it a surprise?
No, surprises only, Fernando. No, I'll share the screen. Here we go. Great. Well, as we're getting to critical mass here, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Laura Volmer, and I am the Community and Nutrition and Health Advisor at UC Cooperative Extension, and I'm also a member of the South Bay Food Justice Collaborative. Today, we will be talking about roots of inequity, farms, and housing, and this is again the second webinar in our series, Building Equity in Silicon Valley's Food System. Before we jump into the content, just a couple of logistical notes. So the first is that if you'd like to listen to today's webinar in Spanish, interpretation is available and it's already been enabled. So please select interpretation at the bottom of your screen and then click on the Spanish channel.
Y luego el idioma que quieren escuchar.
We figured out how to do this. I also wanted to give some quick Zoom instructions. So please keep yourself muted, except for when we're in small group breakouts and during the Q&A after each of the presentations today. Please feel free to make abundant use of the chat for any questions or comments that you might have. And if you're having any technical difficulties or you need any support, our organizing team is here to help, and you can message Lucy Diekman with any difficulties that you are having. So here's our plan for today. In just a moment, Joe CV from the Health Department will lead us in an invigorating stretch, and then I'll recap our first webinar. From there, we'll hear from our first speaker, Cecilia Su, who will offer a historical perspective, and then we'll have a break with optional discussion in small breakout rooms, and then Nicole Montojo will join us for her presentation on Roots, Race, and Place focused on housing. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Joe for the stretch, and I'll stop my share so you can see her.
Good afternoon, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. I'm Joe. I work for the Public Health Department. It's nice to see you all. So remember we did our coconut stretch last time? We're going to do the same thing again today because it was so popular and because, frankly, I love coconut. I don't know if you do, but I do. Okay, y'all ready? We're going to start with a C. We're going to go this way, arms curved, and with a big, big stretch. Can you feel it? Oh my goodness. I can totally feel that. Okay. And then we're going, oh, big wide. Oh, get those shoulder blades back. Oh, it feels so good. Okay, we're going C, opposite side. My C's all funky. There we go. Awesome. Okay, we're going back to O. Again, bigger, bigger. You can stand up if you want to. You stand up, you won't see me, so I'm not going to, but Okay, and then we're gonna go end, which means go down, touch your toes. Touch your toes, everybody. Really stretch that out, stretch the back. Oh, yes, love it. Okay, and then you. Like a goalpost. Everybody watch the Super Bowl? Okay, and then we're gonna end with a T. Fingers reaching for the stars or the sides. Oh yeah, you can even just like twirl your little wrists here back and forth. We are gonna get limber for today. Fantastic. All right, woohoo! Go team. Okay, I'm gonna turn it back to Laura.
Thanks, Joe. Coconut, it's always an effective stretch. All right. So hopping now into our recap for last time, I want to say thank you again for those of you who joined us last time. And if you weren't able to make it, we're dropping a link to the recording of the last webinar in the chat so that you can watch it if you haven't had the chance to do so. So last time, Lucy introduced the South Bay Food Justice Collaborative and our approach, and she also shared this definition of what an equitable food system is so that we have something of a common vision or shared purpose here. So in an equitable food system, everyone has what they need to participate, prosper, and make decisions to reach their full potential, regardless of differences, including class, disability status, gender, and race. Lucy also shared that
Potencial. Lucy también compartió que nuestro enfoque va a ser en centrar
systems that cause and perpetuate food injustices by first looking broadly at root causes of these structural issues, understanding their impacts, and finally learning about strategies for making systems change. And last time we started on this path by hearing from Dr. Ann Lopez, who shared historical context and information about current working and living conditions for farm workers. We also heard from Solange Aguilar, a promotora from Vegilution, who reflected on her experiences helping families access food, and from Javier Zamora, a farmer who shared his philosophy and approach and exhorted us all to learn and understand where our food is coming from. We also wanted to say thanks to all of you who completed our evaluation survey, and we wanted to share back some of your key takeaways or learnings. So lots of folks told us that they appreciated learning more about labor conditions for farm workers and the experience of a farmer. Folks also learned about food access programs and policies via Solange's talk. And finally, folks also reported excitement about learning about the many organizations within our community working towards food sovereignty. We also asked you all what action you might take with the information you learned last time, and here are some of the popular responses. I have to tell you that I think this probably the most popular response was that you were going to follow JSM Organics on Instagram, and many of you also indicated that you had a plan to visit the farm or were going to take Javier up on that offer. We also heard that folks plan to advocate for immigration reform, and we have a link there if you're interested in taking action on that. Also, there was an interest in advocating for better conditions for farm workers. Many folks said that they plan to buy from small producers. Other folks indicated an interest in supporting farm to school efforts. And then finally, a very, very popular response was to spread the
los
word.
esfuerzos de la granja en el nivel escolar.
From last time,
Y muchos dijeron también que van a difundir la palabra.
Members, etc. So with that sort of very, very quick recap of our webinar, I wanted to linger on this graphic of the food system as I asked Fernando and Abigail to launch a poll. So last time we asked how you had personally engaged with the food system, and today we're hoping to better understand how your work engages with the food system. And we'll give you just a couple of minutes to respond, and we'll share the results later in the webinar. So we'll give just a couple of seconds here. And as the results from that trickle in, I'll shift over to introducing our first speaker. Sorry, just a second, need to rearrange some things. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Cecilia Su from the History Department at the University of California, Davis. And as I said, Cecilia will share a historical perspective on agriculture in the Santa Clara Valley. And this is an especial honor for me, as my great-grandmother was one of the Chinese agricultural workers that Cecilia writes about. So Cecilia, I'm handing it over to you.
Thank you so much, Laura. Can you all hear me? All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen. I hope that you can all see that. So thank you so much for being here this afternoon. I'm so grateful for the opportunity to participate in this webinar series. I'm grateful to Emily Schwing of Vegilution for inviting me, and to Lucy and to the many others who on the organizing team who made this event possible. So
evento y que lo hicieron posible. He colaborado con Vegilution,
the work they do, and it's really an honor for me to connect with this larger network of professionals and organizations working on issues of equity in the food system. So I'm at UC Davis, and at the University of California, there's been a lot of emphasis, especially in recent years, on publicly engaged scholarship. So that's been a big buzzword, thinking about how academic research can reach broader audiences besides just scholars, and can have a meaningful impact on communities. So I think this event is a terrific example of that partnership, and I appreciate the chance to be a part of it. So I am a historian of the United States, and I specialize in Asian American history, immigration, race, and ethnicity. And I'm delighted today to have the opportunity to talk about agricultural history. I think it's an often overlooked and understudied topic in US history, and Asian American history in particular. And then in Santa Clara County, where I think most of you are, or in Silicon Valley, the history of agriculture has definitely been overshadowed by the rise of high tech. So I grew up in Sunnyvale and Cupertino, with tech companies down the street from our house. So if you look on this image in the bottom left corner, you see Apple and Symantec. So that's approximately where I grew up, and my parents still live there. And the founders of Apple, the two Steves, they graduated from my high school, from Homestead High School. And so as a child and teenager, I saw remnants of an agricultural way of life, and I was really intrigued by it. I heard teachers and neighbors, older adults talk about the orchards that had once covered the area. Back then, when I was growing up, there were still a few of those around. I'll show you this image of an apricot dry yard. So from the late 19th century, and then it's in 1980, there were still apricots drying in Sunnyvale. But I'm sure all of you know that if you drive around the heart of Santa Clara Valley today, you will probably not stumble upon any kind of orchard, unless maybe it's like a little, they call it a heritage orchard that's fenced off and preserved for posterity. But for much of the late 19th and 20th centuries, the Santa Clara Valley was known around the world for its horticultural productivity. It was called the Garden of the World, the Valley of Heart's Delight. And the valley's identity as an agricultural capital, if we take the peak years to be approximately 1880 to 1940, as I do in my book, those still surpass the number of years it's been known as a high-tech center. Moreover, it's not just the history of agriculture that most residents are not aware of today, but also that long, deep history of Asian immigrants who farmed there. I mean, that's not something that I learned about personally growing up in the area. In graduate school at Stanford, I began to research that history, and that eventually became my first book. And I also show an image of a California history textbook that I've worked on that is also a great resource. There's plenty of agricultural history in there, the state's history. And so my book, Garden of the World, uncovers the history of Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino immigrant farmers and farm laborers in the Santa Clara Valley. Within the academic scholarship, on Asian American history, there have been many studies of urban ethnic enclaves, Chinatowns, Little Tokyos, and many multi-ethnic studies of places like Los Angeles, neighborhoods in San Francisco and Seattle, which makes sense because that's where significant populations of Asian immigrants were. But given that many Asian immigrants were heavily involved in agriculture since the 19th century, it was surprising to me back when I was in graduate school that there was so little historical research on the rural experiences of Asian Americans. All 5 Asian immigrant groups that came in the 19th and early 20th century, so Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Filipinos, East Indians, they were all primarily engaged in agriculture. And the migration of Asian immigrants coincided with the rise of intensive agriculture in California. As it turns out, the place where I had grown up, the Santa Clara Valley, was the ideal location to research the history of rural Asian immigrants there. Chinese, Japanese, Filipinos, they all played a major role in agriculture and in fundamentally altering the agricultural economy and landscape, as well as white residents' ideas about race, gender, and what it meant to be an American family farmer. And I decided early on in my research that I didn't want to focus on just one immigrant group, but in order to tell that the story, the book had to include all 3 and to analyze these overlapping waves of migration and settlement. And I'll note that in Santa Clara County, there were no significant Korean or South Asian populations before the 1960s. So that's a little bit about how I came to this research. But for this talk, I was asked to give an overview of the history of agriculture in Santa Clara County, focusing on who participated in it and had access to land. And I'm going to do that by discussing the experiences of Chinese and Japanese immigrant farmers and farm laborers in the late 19th and early 20th centuries and some key aspects of that history. So I'm not going to get into the history of Filipino or Mexican farm laborers who were an important part of the seasonal labor force in the 1930s, but there's a chapter in my book that does focus on that. And then, as you see on the outline, then I will switch gears and talk briefly about some current research at the end of this talk that I've been doing on the history of Southeast Asian refugee community gardens in the 1980s, which I think has some implications for how we think about urban agriculture today. So this is where we're
los refugiados.
going. And so to begin,
Entonces, para comenzar, quiero
the broad economic shifts in the 19th century that produced a reliance on Chinese agricultural labor in California, and also discuss the cultural and ideological changes that occurred at the same time. In Northern California, agricultural possibilities suddenly opened up with the completion of the nation's first transcontinental railroad in 1869, which connected California to new markets. And even though Chinese workers were not invited to the ceremony, you don't see them pictured in this famous photograph that commemorates the moment that the tracks joined. They were about 20,000 Chinese immigrants worked on the Central Pacific Railroad. They were responsible for the dangerous, difficult work of building the section of track through the Sierra Nevada mountains. And then many of the Chinese who were discharged from railroad work then found work in California's wheat fields. In 1870, the Chinese made up about 18% of all farm laborers in California. And at that time, in the 1870s, California was one of the world's largest wheat producers, and it led the nation in wheat production. You can see on this map that Santa Clara County was a major wheat growing region, along with San Joaquin, Yolo County, where I'm at, Solano County, and Stanislaus counties. So wheat is a non-perishable crop that requires little or no irrigation. It was easy to grow. And it was also a crop that was familiar to American settlers from the Midwest. So many of them had come to California during the gold rush. They failed to get rich as miners, and then they decided to settle in California and replicate the farms and communities they had known before. And they were able to take advantage of technological advances like the McCormick reaper that greatly reduced the need for hand labor. So you've got that kind of era of wheat growing in California. But by the 1880s, California farmers moved away from wheat. Wheat prices were falling, there was more competition. Farmers elsewhere in the American Midwest and in Europe, Asia, South America, Australia, they were all raising wheat better and cheaper than California farmers. And meanwhile, a new market for specialty crops emerged, which was made possible, again, by the railroads. Farmers were no longer completely reliant on water transportation for marketing their crops. So trains could carry new crops, and they could also carry very delicate fruits like berries and peaches to distant markets. So in the Santa Clara Valley, farmers turned increasingly from wheat to orchard fruits, which they could grow for more profit on smaller farms. And some of the fruits that the Santa Clara Valley was most famous for were prunes, apricots, cherries, and pears. I think you see some peaches in this image as well. The transition from wheat to specialty crop production generated a huge demand for manual farm labor, and that's because of the seasonal and perishable nature of fruit and vegetable crops. So mechanization and labor-saving technology didn't apply to these types of crops. So this shift in agricultural production was made possible by Chinese labor. Many of these former railroad workers that we're talking about who built the Central Pacific found work in wheat, now then labor to grow deciduous fruits. And in California, and citrus fruits, grapes, vegetables, and nuts. And so this is what happened in the Santa Clara Valley, also in the Sacramento Valley, where I'm located now, and many parts of California. So in this transition from wheat to specialty crops, Chinese immigrants built roads, they cleared land for farming, they planted, pruned, harvested, they did backbreaking physical labor, as well as very skilled horticultural work that required a significant amount of knowledge. In 1884, Chinese were about 50% of farm laborers in California, and that figure was as high as almost 90% of all farm laborers in some counties in California. So that's an overview of the economic context that produced a reliance on Chinese agricultural labor in California. Accompanying these economic changes and shifts in agricultural production were cultural and ideological changes. So I want to talk a little bit about this because I think it's important to understand how these farmers, they saw fruit growing as more than just a business. They weren't just producing another crop, but they attached cultural meaning to their work. They called themselves orchardists and vineyardists in the 1880s. They developed this new ideology about fruit growing, orchards, and family farming as being this superior way of life. And it was a vision of white agrarianism that was based on race and gender ideals. And it was a vision filled with contradictions. And so that's in large part what my book is about. On one hand, these white American farmers constructed an identity as independent, self-reliant family farmers who worked the land. They succeeded through their own hard work and determination. But on the other hand, they were utterly dependent in reality on Chinese labor in the late 19th century, and then the labor of other farm laborers of color subsequently. So how did white growers resolve this paradox? In my research on the Santa Clara Valley, I argue that they did this by constructing this kind of racialized and gender discourse of labor that confined the Chinese to certain types of agricultural work and tried to write them out of orchard fruit growing. So it happened on the level of culture and ideology. In the Santa Clara Valley, orchard fruits were associated with white farm families like the ones in this photograph, while the less lucrative and more labor-intensive crops like berries, vegetables, garden seed was a big industry here, were considered the domain of Chinese and then later Japanese farmers. And I will note that what's unique about the Santa Clara Valley is that the multifaceted nature of horticultural production, the fact that you do have this range of and variety of production there, that's what made it possible for whites to imagine a labor system that was segregated by race and by crop. So you have this reliance on Asian labor and also this racial hierarchy of production where white growers classify Chinese contributions to agriculture as too tedious, too menial for whites to perform. And they refer to the work that Chinese and later Japanese immigrants did as using terms like, this is very exacting, it's careful, it's particular work, it's handwork. And to an extent, evidence shows that indeed many Chinese immigrants were involved in berry growing and vegetable and seed growing in the Santa Clara Valley. So my research in the county lease records shows that about a third of the leases recorded between white landowners and Chinese tenants specified berry cultivation, mostly strawberries. And so there's other evidence that, yeah, they were heavily involved in these industries. But I also found that this neat division by race and crop did not always hold. So in a number of cases, Chinese tenants did grow deciduous fruits in addition to strawberries, sometimes on the same property. And so that contradicted that idea of that there's a strict division, racial division by crop. And this is an image of Chinese working at a prune dipper. There's a prune orchard in the background, and I discovered this image in my research, and it happened to be near where I used to live in Sunnyvale, and if you know the corner of Homestead and Hollenbeck there. But you see that in the day-to-day operations of farms, these precise racialized and gendered categories of labor were difficult to maintain. And white growers did not always distinguish between exacting work that only Chinese did and labor that was fit for white help. And so you have a lot more kind of intermixing of jobs, of people, of variety of crops and tasks. And so I found this in diary entries of local growers showing them that they were doing the same types of work as their Chinese workers, that there was constant interaction. And the Chinese were involved in really every aspect of running a farm. And there was no agricultural work that white farmers felt was beyond the competence of Chinese immigrants. So despite claims that family farming was the norm in Santa Clara Valley agriculture, whites and Chinese relied and bargained with each other over the terms of labor. Chinese farmers and laborers insisted on fair treatment. They communicated their expectations. They were indispensable to agricultural production on many levels. Again, they were not limited to certain crops or tasks. And there were economic conditions that gave rise to white growers' dependence on Asian labor, as well as cultural and ideological visions of farming that were steeped in race and racism. So I wanted to see if there's any questions. I can't see the chat at the moment, but you can let me know before I go on to the next section.
There aren't currently any. Oh, here they come. There's a question now, which I can read for you.
Great.
So Sarah is wondering, how did the population and white perception of Chinese and Japanese workers shift with the Chinese Exclusion Act and Gentlemen's Agreements?
Oh, great. Well, I'm going to be sort of covering that in this next section. So maybe I can try to address it there, and yeah, and then you can see if that does answer your question, perhaps. So yeah, if you don't mind, I'll go that route. Because in this section, I wanted to talk about how we can understand the role of race and legal constraints, so including Chinese exclusion, including other means of excluding the Asian population there, because I think this is a really important part of understanding the history of Asian immigrants in Santa Clara Valley agriculture. So there's this paradox of Asian immigrants being central to agricultural development and production. At the same time, they were targeted by laws that were designed to keep them out of the country and out of farming. And here I'm going to focus on the community of Japanese immigrant farmers who lived in the Santa Clara Valley, mainly in and around San Jose in the early 20th century. But before that, I actually want to go back in time and talk about a law that passed when there were no Asian immigrants at all in the country. And this was the Naturalization Act of 1790. And it stated that anyone applying for naturalized citizenship in the United States had to be a free white person. So I'm sure all of you know that naturalized citizenship is what happens if you're an immigrant. So like I was born in Hong Kong and my family moved to this country and had to apply to become naturalized citizens. in contrast to birthright citizenship. So if you're born in the United States, you automatically have citizenship. So according to this law from 1790, only free white persons could be naturalized citizens of the country. And at the time, this law was designed to exclude people of African descent from US citizenship. But in effect, it prevented all Asian immigrants from becoming US citizens until that racial restriction to naturalization was rescinded in 1952. So again, American-born citizens of Asian immigrants, they could become automatically citizens. In World War II, there were some Asian immigrants who served in the military, and so they were granted citizenship for their service. But for the most part, I think this is an overlooked yet foundational law. So you think about all those years from 1790 to 1952, Asian immigrants could not become citizens. They did not have the right to vote. They could not participate in the political life of the country. They did not have access to benefits available to US citizens. And this racial restriction to citizenship also gave rise to other discriminatory laws that targeted what were called aliens ineligible to citizenship. So, for example, during the California gold rush of the mid-19th century, Chinese miners were forced to pay a foreign miners tax. And so that drew on this same language, the fact that you can't become a citizen. So if it didn't say Chinese had to pay this tax, it said if you cannot become a citizen, you're liable to pay this tax. And it did target the Chinese. And then in 1913, lawmakers in California used, again, this legal denial of citizenship to pass alien land laws that targeted Japanese immigrants, but they affected all Asian immigrant groups. And these laws, which I'll talk about in a moment, restricted land ownership and access to farmland. So I think it's hard to overstate the impact of that legal denial of citizenship that goes back to the 1790 law. It greatly facilitated the United States government's treatment of people of Asian descent as racially different and perpetual foreigners, reinforcing popular stereotypes. So if we even think about the spike in anti-Asian violence during the pandemic, that's just a recent chapter in our nation's history of viewing Asians in the United States as outsiders, as not truly American or capable of being American. So before I go into exactly how alien land laws worked and the impact they had on Japanese immigrant farmers, I just want to take a brief look at the lives they led and the work they did. So the first Japanese immigrants arrived in Santa Clara County in the 1890s. Most of them came in the 1900s. So somebody mentioned the gentleman's agreement, so that in contrast to Chinese who were legally excluded by federal legislation that passed in 1882 that said all Chinese laborers are restricted from coming into the US, with the Japanese, the government was much more careful in its diplomatic relations with Japan. And so instead of passing a law that excluded all Japanese, there was the gentleman's agreement, which is a series of diplomatic notes that were exchanged between the two governments, where the Japanese government agreed that we are not going to issue passports to laborers going to the United States. And so this was in 1907, 1908. And so most of the Japanese immigrants who came before that. Subsequently, laborers could not come, but many of them sent for their wives. And so there's a period of picture bride migration, and I'll talk a little bit more about family formation. And so what you have is then between 50 and 65% of Japanese immigrants in the US worked in agriculture by 1915. And like the Chinese, Japanese immigrant farm workers tended to concentrate on agricultural work that I talked about was deemed too menial for white residents. So pruning, weeding, thinning, harvesting. And then like the Chinese, most of them specialized in labor-intensive crops like berries and vegetables. They were not, where they weren't really in competition with white farmers. So many Japanese immigrant farmers grew strawberries, celery, asparagus, garden seed, onions, tomatoes, and other vegetables. So they didn't gain the same foothold in the more lucrative deciduous fruit industry. Although again, you do find them doing that. They were engaged in producing all crops. And discriminatory laws contributed to this pattern of crop specialization. So that 1913 California Alien Land Law made it illegal for Japanese farmers to own land. And it also stipulated they could lease it or rent it, but only for up to 3 years. And so that made them concentrate on short-term crops instead of cultivating orchard fruits or other crops that required a longer commitment of time and resources. Despite the hardship and structural discrimination, Japanese immigrants decided to stay in the Santa Clara Valley and build their lives and raise their families there. Through their skill and hard work, some Japanese immigrant families who started out in farming berries and vegetables shifted to more profitable agricultural opportunities. And it's for those families that 1920 was a particularly catastrophic year. So in 1920, a renewed anti-Japanese movement emerged in California, and this was a push to further exclude Japanese immigrants and limit their progress. And in my book, I talk about how this was really tied to family formation. So in that period from 1908, when the Gentleman's Agreement passed, saying no more Japanese laborers who were men, from 1908 until 1920, it was mostly Japanese immigrant women who were coming to join their husbands. And so that was this intense period of family formation. You have women arriving, you have the second generation being born. And that's what I argue by 1920 really scared many white Californians. And what you see in that year is this anti-Japanese movement that was renewed. Opponents of Japanese immigration, like Senator James Phelan, saying that the Japanese are taking the best farmland in California. White families couldn't compete with Japanese families. The Japanese birth rate was much higher than that of white. So you see this on the poster here, all of this attention paid to birth rates and being outnumbered. And so these are all unfounded, but they were repeated claims. And Phelan, of course, some of you might know, has a connection to Santa Clara County. He had been mayor of San Francisco, and then a senator, and he owned Villa Montalvo, which is his country estate in Saratoga. So back to 1920, responding to mounting political pressure from the US, beginning in March of 1920, the Japanese government ended the migration of Japanese women. So it did not issue passports to women who were trying to join their husbands. So they conceded that to the US. And then in that same year, in 1920, anti-Japanese forces in California proposed a revised alien land law as a ballot initiative. And so under this law, Asians could not own or lease agricultural land at all. So this new alien land law passed by a wide margin in November of 1920, with over 74% of voters supporting it. So if you think about what this meant for Japanese immigrant farmers in 1920, many of them were poor, economically marginalized. They could not become citizens. They did not have the right to vote. They lacked political power. They couldn't legally own or rent farmland. They faced discriminatory laws that were unambiguously designed to deny them a way to make a living. And so no doubt many felt fear, resignation, hopelessness, but somehow they moved beyond that fear with a lot of resourcefulness and ingenuity, and they found ways to sustain their livelihoods. And that's the point that I want to turn to next. And I'm going to check the chat if there are any questions. There's a question about, I can see living conditions for farm workers. And so, yeah, it differed over time, but there were difficult conditions. There were often camps that were segregated by race and run by labor contractors from the ethnic community. So there might have been a Chinese labor contractor who ran a camp for farm workers, a Japanese one. Filipinos had their own as well. And then if you know, like San Jose, Japantown, like where it is now, so that was traditionally the kind of urban center for where many Asian immigrants lived or boarded in that area. And I'll just say that. So were there Asian coolies in Santa Clara? So coolies referring to, I think you mean by workers who were kind of indentured and on bound contracts. So that was not the case for migrants to the United States. In Latin America and other parts of the world, you have those systems. For the US and Hawaii, they were what we call free laborers, sometimes in Hawaii on contracts, but they were not indentured workers. Okay, so I'm going to turn to this point about how the history of Asian immigrants in Santa Clara Valley agriculture isn't just about economic contributions, racism, and legal constraints, but how it's important to center their acts of protest, agency, and resilience. And in my book, I write about the various actions Japanese immigrants undertook to keep farming after 1920.
Para seguir ellos usaron el sistema de la corte, de los tribunales.
They hired attorneys to set up test cases saying this is unconstitutional. And one of those test cases originated in San Jose and involved a farmer or sharecropper named Genzaburo Inoue, who farmed berries. And in 1920, he lived on Rock Avenue in San Jose with his wife, Isono, and 4 young children that year. And so this is later after that Supreme Court case, but you can see his family there. And Genzaburo Inoue is in that bottom left corner. He's got glasses. He's holding a small child and a hat in his hand, and his wife is next to him. And this is his older daughter getting married there. And this photo comes from his grandson, who I met a number of years ago and lives in Mountain View. So Inoue contended that the 1920 Alien Land Law violated the 14th Amendment and denied him equal protection of the law. And that case went all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1923, although that legal battle didn't end up overturning the law. But Japanese farmers used that legal route to protest. And they also turned to their immediate families to help them keep farming. In my research in the archives of the Santa Clara County Recorder's Office, I noticed this interesting pattern. So in the late 1920s and 30s, on their 18th birthdays, or shortly after, some American-born Japanese, or the Nisei, they went down to the recorder's office in San Jose and they signed documents that secured farmland for their families. And so in nearly all cases, these were the oldest sons who were born in California. So they were the first in their families who were eligible to sign a lease contract for property. So their parents had immigrated from Japan in the early 20th century. Most of them were in their 40s and 50s. And so it was clear to me that these parents asked their American-born children, now you've reached the age of majority, you've turned 18, now you can help us by signing this lease to get farmland, and you can do this legally. And so Nisei, who attained the age of majority in the 1920s, found themselves leasing land not just for their own parents, but for other members of the community as well. And this is because there were very few of them who were old enough to do so by then. So 85% of California-born Japanese in Santa Clara County were under the age of 10 in 1920. So they had no way of signing these leases. And so most families didn't have children who would turn 18 until the 1930s. So Hatsui Kanemoto, whose family farmed on Trimble Road in San Jose, she recalled her father subleasing their farm from a Nisei acquaintance. And this happened to be a young man whose brother later became her husband. And that young man leased the land from a white landowner. And she talked about how that's how we were able to farm. And that was the only way, because we weren't old enough to lease it. So Kanemoto herself was born in 1916. She would not have been eligible to lease farmland until the mid-1930s. And then you have Japanese farmers reaching outside their communities. So some arranged to be salaried employees or foremen working for white landowners. So remember, they couldn't rent the land themselves. And so but they could sign up to become, all right, I'm an employee. And in this position, they had steady income, but they probably didn't have much autonomy and limited job security. And in some cases, Japanese farmers even worked for non-whites. A farmer named Heikichi Azaki became the foreman of an apple and pear orchard in San Jose in 1927. And his boss was a Chinese American man named Thomas Foon Chu, who was born in San Francisco. And so he was born in the US, so he was able to own and lease land. And Chu was a successful entrepreneur who ran a cannery in Alviso called the Bayside Canning Company. And so if you look in the fruit boxes in this picture, those are the initials of Chu's cannery, the Bayside Canning Company. So Izaki's wife, Yukino, also worked in this orchard, and she's in this photograph. She's the taller woman there. And so during harvest time, Heikichi Izaki, working for Thomas Funshu, supervised as many as 40 laborers, including Filipino and Portuguese workers. And then in 1929, Chu placed the Izaki's oldest son, Masami, in charge of an apricot orchard he had purchased on Mount Pleasant Road in San Jose. So these are just some examples I came across in my research that shows how, even though they were shut out of California agriculture by law, Japanese immigrants devised new and innovative, brilliant methods and strategies, both within their families and ethnic community, and in collaboration with landowners outside of the Japanese community. And that was how they maintained this enduring presence in California agriculture and how they kept farming. But I want to caution against romanticizing resourcefulness, creativity, and a resilient spirit. So in the case of Japanese farmers, we need to acknowledge that while they continued farming after 1920, they also continued to face immense challenges. In the 1930s, the Great Depression hit, and then with World War II and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the federal government forcibly removed Japanese Americans from their communities to internment camps. Again, they were singled out on the basis of their race and ethnicity. They lost their homes, farms, property. They suffered enormous economic damages and intangible losses. After the war, many couldn't go back to the lives they had worked so hard to build for years, and very few of them regained the farms they had worked on before incarceration. Some became gardeners or janitors. They did other menial work. So creative and resourceful responses are not enough, and they're not substitutes for real justice and equality. So on that point, I want to shift to telling you a little bit about my current research, and then I'll close. But I think this might connect more directly to some of the work that many of you are involved in today. So my current book project chronicles the evolution of Southeast Asian refugee resettlement policy from 1975 to 1996. So that seems quite different than my first book, but the origins of it came from my interest in agriculture. So at UC Davis, I have taught numerous Hmong American students whose families engage in small-scale farming in the Central Valley, and maybe like many of you, I've frequented the stands of Hmong and other Southeast Asian vendors at local farmers markets, and so I became curious about their history. And when I started delving into it, I realized that agriculture was just one aspect of a much more expansive story about refugee resettlement and American politics after the Vietnam War. And so, you know, this book is about a lot of different things relating to politics and policy, but while doing the research, I kept coming across mentions of refugee community gardens established in the 1980s. And that kind of brought me to the path that then eventually led to this article that came out in 2021 on community gardens. I discovered that thousands of refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos cultivated plots in these community gardens across the United States. And these gardens relied on a combination of public funding, private donations, and volunteer initiative. And I have on there another article I published on farm cooperatives. So in contrast to these garden projects, there were these other larger commercially oriented projects for refugees that were more ambitious, more difficult to execute, and they faced declining support over the years, while the enthusiasm for community gardens really took off. And so I was really struck by this phenomenon that giving refugees derelict marginal land to grow their own food, in some cases even charging them for using that land, that became one of the most popular refugee resettlement initiatives of the 1980s. And this made sense in the context of Reagan-era attacks on the welfare state and wariness about government spending on social programs and entitlements. Community gardens were uncontroversial, feel-good projects that required relatively little investment and offered uplift through self-help. So for garden advocates who worked for voluntary and government agencies, this was a win-win endeavor. Refugees could connect with the land as they had in Southeast Asia. They could draw on their agricultural skills to grow food for themselves and their families and save on food expenses. So in the 1980s, urban agriculture became this panacea for poverty, economic equality. People said this is how refugees can deal with their post-traumatic stress. It can address cuts in welfare spending. And I don't want to deny that there were benefits for refugees through these garden programs. We see that refugees definitely experience the gardens as spaces of productivity, of community, and physical nourishment. And they were the ones who asked for garden plots. They cultivated vegetables and medicinal herbs that were familiar to them. They reaped tangible harvests. They also regained status, confidence, and a sense of dignity through these community gardens. And this quote, it's kind of long, on Cambodian gardeners really attests to that. Yet refugees also felt huge dissonances in their experiences of gardening. They spoke of how there was little resemblance between the gardens and their rural existence in Southeast Asia, despite all these garden promoters were saying, wow, they get to do exactly what they were doing back home. But the refugees themselves are like, this is nothing like what we had. And they talked about how they felt sadness, loss, dislocation when they gardened. The frequency of theft, vandalism, and harassment in the gardens also underscored the chasm between refugees' agricultural experiences in Asia and America. So some of my key takeaways was that urban agriculture in the 1980s for refugees was empowering, and it did show individual and community resilience. But when we center refugee perspectives, we see that it was much more complex than that. And moreover, I think that we need to acknowledge the limits of initiatives that are predicated on ideas of self-help, ideas of economic self-sufficiency that put the burden on individuals to lift themselves up and that emphasize private initiative rather than state support. In January of this year, the Biden administration unveiled a new program called Welcome Corps, and that allows groups of private citizens to sponsor refugees from around the world with the help of nonprofit resettlement organizations. So such voluntary efforts can be impactful. I don't want to diminish them, but I think that this history of refugee community gardens is a caution against relying primarily on private voluntary efforts to meet refugee needs. Benevolent intentions and volunteerism are not substitutes for effective and humane government-sponsored programs. In the case of community gardens, I found that they even shifted the focus away from deeper problems and the need for more expansive domestic resettlement measures at a formative moment when such policies could have made a difference for refugees like the Hmong. So in conclusion, the history of Chinese and Japanese immigrants in agriculture in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and then the more recent experiences of Southeast Asian refugee gardeners shows us how individuals and communities made choices in response to conditions and circumstances beyond their control. And in doing so, they created spaces where new agrarian dreams could flourish. While agricultural opportunities and acts of resilience cannot be viewed as remedies for structural racism and inequality that have persisted in the history of this country, I think those histories can continue to inspire us today in working for equity and social change through the food system. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cecilia. And I think we'll open it up for questions. And we'll start with one in the chat, which I will broaden a little bit, which is about if there were tensions between Japanese and Chinese farm workers, but perhaps you could say between sort of different racial ethnic groups.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I do talk about that there were both kind of inter-ethnic tensions within, say, the Japanese community itself, and then the inter-ethnic means with different groups, and then intra-ethnic, even within groups themselves. I think what I point out, one example of this is not actually between Chinese and Japanese communities, but between Japanese and Filipinos in the 1930s. And so I do talk about how that those tensions existed, and then how during World War II, they were really exacerbated. And so there is, but I don't want to kind of overemphasize that, because I think you see cooperation and you see conflict, and that's, it's really hard to overgeneralize that. So in some cases, these groups they were all marginalized, and they were competing for kind of scant resources. And so we have to put those conflicts in that context.
Great. And folks who have questions, you are welcome to unmute and ask, or continue to use the chat, and I'll ask them for you. So this is a question about community gardens, and the question is, did the community gardens provide opportunities to learn new business skills? In other words, were, I guess, gardeners able to start small businesses and sell the food they were growing, or things like that?
Right. Yeah, I would say for the most part, the gardens that I looked at, and it's difficult to kind of quantify all of them. They are some were formal and informal, but for most of them, the intention was that this is just for home consumption and to support their families. And so the goal was not really to sell it. There were exceptions. So like in Louisiana, for example, in Vietnamese communities, some gardeners did sell to the local community, and they were larger market gardens. In Massachusetts, you do have the Chimera growers. They're ending up selling quite a bit of their produce in farmers markets. For the most part, these garden programs were not designed for that purpose. The farm cooperatives that I mentioned, and I have another article about that, were designed to teach skills and to turn refugees into what they call modern American farmers. But like I said, those programs were much more difficult to get off the ground, and they kind of didn't get a lot of support. And unfortunately, the government ended up pulling funding for some major projects there.
Great. There is also a question about the title of your books, but I see that our organizing team has already put those in the chat, so thank you. Any last questions for Cecilia? If not, we'll just say thanks. And Cecilia, hopefully you'll get a chance to read some of the notes in the chat, but it sounds like for many folks, this was resonant for their family history or lived experiences. So thank you so much for coming today.
Thank you.
Great. And with that, we are going to transition to about 10 minutes of either optional breakout room discussion, or if you'd like, you can just take a break during this time. So I will share the couple of questions we've generated for you all. So offering the opportunity to reflect in small groups on how the connection you see between the topics that we've covered both in webinar 1 and so far today with your work, and or opening a space for conversations about challenges that your family or community might have experienced accessing land or housing. So I'm going to do my best to explain how this breakout room concept works, and Fernando and Abigail will interrupt me if I'm doing a bad job of explaining it. But as I understand it, in just a moment, they'll open the breakout rooms and you can choose a room and get in there, introduce yourself to your sort of roommates. And if you see that there are more than 5 people in the room, then move on and start a new one. So we want these to be not too large, so that everyone has a chance to participate in the discussion. So they will open those rooms. If you're, looking for 10 minutes away from the screen, which is also a perfectly fine thing to do, we will meet back here at 4:10 for our second speaker. So go ahead, Abigail.
Sorry, I was just gonna add that the first breakout room number 1, will be a Spanish language breakout room. So
Perfect.
if you're looking for Spanish language, go to breakout room 1. Otherwise, go to one of the other rooms. So I'll open those now. And again, they're optional, so you can choose whether or not you want to participate.
All right. And then otherwise, we'll see you back here at 4:10. Maybe I'll say, if you are not sure how to find your way to a breakout room, on the bottom tab of the sort of Zoom ribbon, there's a place that says breakout rooms, and you can join a room there.
And also, Abigail, we can broadcast the questions that are in the presentation to everyone in the breakout rooms. That would be really useful.
So Fernando, it's only letting me do it only lets me do a limited amount of characters. So I can't do all the questions.
Okay. So we can broadcast one first and then,
And then
the
the
other
other
one.
one. Okay. Okay.
And if you'd like to be sent to a room, just raise your hand and we'll send you. Great. Well, welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed either your break or your conversation. And I think we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker. So hold on. Sorry, you think I would know where everything on my screen is, but not quite. Okay, but so we are going to quickly share the results of our poll from
Compartir nuestra encuesta.
So as a result, as a reminder, we were asking about folks' interaction with different parts of the food system. And it looks like we are a fairly broadly defined group, sort of all different kinds of interaction. Though it looks like food access is maybe a sort of unifying theme for many of us, as well as education. So just giving a sense of who's here in the audience, and I'll stop sharing the results and transition over to introducing our next speaker, which is Nicole Montojo, who is going to share a bit about her report on roots, race, and place. So Nicole, take it away.
Thank you very much, Laura. Give me 1 second to share my screen. It's nice to be here with all of you, and thank you so much to the organizing committee. For inviting me to talk today, and thank you so much, Cecilia, for your presentation. I really appreciate everything that you shared. Sorry, 1 second. This is not working like I hoped it would. Okay. Here we go. Okay. Thanks for your patience. So my name is Nicole Montojo. I'm a staff researcher at the Othering and Belonging Institute at UC Berkeley. My background is in urban planning and advocacy around housing, public health, and racial justice. And prior to working at OBI, I worked in affordable housing advocacy in the South Bay with Silicon Valley at Home. And I'm based in Fremont, so not too far away from most of you. And to share a little bit about the institute that I work at. The Othering and Belonging Institute is a center for scholarship, research, and community partnerships and strategy at UC Berkeley. And housing is a key factor in our work and is central to the work that I do at the Institute. And we see it as really a key factor in belonging and who gets to call a place home and whether that home is connected to resources, opportunities, and community supports that allow a person to be a full member of society. And at the same time, housing policies and systems have been historically used to marginalize or other specific groups and drive economic and racial inequality. And so I firmly believe that we must contend with these systems as part of advancing structural belonging. And I think the same can be said for food policies and systems. And so before I dive into my talk about history, I want to focus in first a bit on the connection between housing and food. And like I was mentioning, housing is a key element of belonging, as is food. They're both defining factors of well-being and simply very much our basic needs. And you might have heard this quote before, "The rent eats first." It's from a book that has gained a lot of popularity. It's called Evicted by Matthew Desmond. And the idea here, I probably don't have to spell it out, is that housing and affordability directly affects everyone's ability to meet the rest of our basic needs. And often if you're being forced to choose between paying for your rent so you don't get evicted and everything else that you need to survive, that's often a very impossible trade-off. And after rent, often for many folks, there's very little available for food, healthcare, childcare, transportation, etc. And this is especially true with the housing crisis in the Bay Area. I wanted to just share some figures to ground our conversation. This is a snapshot of what fair market rents are in San Mateo and Santa Clara County, and then also what that translates to in terms of the annual income that's needed to afford those rents. And so just focusing in on this part that's in a box right here, a 2-bedroom apartment would require an annual income of over or close to $128,000 in San Mateo County, and then in Santa Clara County, close to $115,000. And the median incomes in both these counties are lower than this amount. So half of the folks in our region or in the South Bay are unable to afford the levels of rent that we have that are needed, which means that a lot of folks are struggling. And I don't have to tell you this. I'm sure this is all a reality that we're facing as a region. And it's important to look at how this is playing out in terms of race. And so I wanted to share a few figures specific to that. This chart is showing cost burden renter households by race and ethnicity for San Mateo County. So this is the share of households for each racial group that is paying for more than 30% of their income in housing, on housing, sorry. So take the middle bar here. So 61% of Latino or Latinx households pay more than 30% of their income in housing. And actually 35% are severely rent burdened, meaning they're paying more than 50% of their incomes in housing. And you can see that the rates of cost burden are higher for Black and Latinx renters than they are for the overall renter population. And the same is true for Santa Clara
Lo
County.
mismo se ve para el condado de Santa Clara.
American renters. So this chart is only showing 3 racial groups and then the overall population. But you can see that the rates are, again, disproportionately higher for Latino or Latinx renters. And these racial dimensions of housing unaffordability shape all factors of our lives, patterns of segregation and access to resources, including healthy food. They shape our vulnerability to gentrification and displacement pressures, or in other words, our ability, a family's ability to stay in the Bay Area as housing costs continually rise. And if folks are pushed out to areas that are less expensive, these areas are more likely to also be food deserts. And so this map here is showing kind of the geography of displacement and gentrification in the Bay Area. There's a link to the actual map there if you want to zoom in and see what the data looks like. But what this research and looking at how displacement impacts on the Bay has shown is that the majority of low-income households of color live in neighborhoods that are gentrifying or at risk of gentrification. And then Black households are twice as likely as white households to live in neighborhoods that are at risk of gentrification. And then housing as a direct connection to our health and well-being. It impacts both our physical and mental health. If you're dealing with the chronic stress of housing instability or long commutes, or just the stress of facing unaffordability of basic needs that are essential to health. And the research shows that where you live shapes your life expectancy. And so this is some data on life expectancy for the Bay Area. And what it shows is that the difference, there's a pretty big difference just within the Bay Area alone. And the difference between the highest and lowest life expectancy for Bay Area zip codes is over 13 years. And that, to just put into context, is like that could be the difference between seeing your grandchildren grow up or not. And life expectancy is more than 5 years greater in highly segregated white neighborhoods compared to highly segregated Black or Latinx neighborhoods. So this has huge implications for our daily lives, for equity, and our ability to experience stability and belonging. And so I am curious to hear from you all how some of these housing issues might be showing up in your work on food systems. If anyone wants to share some thoughts on that in the chat, I would welcome that. And I'll try to keep an eye on it as well. And maybe I'll also pause and see if anyone would like to share out loud.
I'd like to make a comment, just that it feels so big to try to be able to affect change in housing. I see absolutely the connection between the housing and the food systems, but it's just daunting to think how you can fix the housing situation. I guess, and advocacy seems like the only way that I can think of, but yeah, just don't know how do you think about that? What could we do?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I agree. It is daunting, and I would say we all have a role to play, and that's something that I want to talk about next. And part of what I'm hoping to share is how I think about what needs to change. And a key part of that is really like understanding the history of how we got here. And thank you for asking that. And I want to come back to that question. Let's see, if no one else wants to jump in, I will continue on, and I'll say, please feel free to keep adding questions to the chat, and I'll try to pause and answer them as we go. Okay. So like I was just mentioning, I think key to how I approach this work is to understand what it'll take to undo systemic racism in housing. We need to understand how we got to where we are today. And what we see is that displacement today is built upon a history of exclusion and dispossession centered on race and driven by the logic of capitalism. And the history that established these inequities is about who owned land, who had access to capital, who held political power, and all of that, which determines and still remains at the root of determining who can call the Bay Area home. And I think Cecilia's research spoke to that really strongly as well. And so the research that I've been doing at the Institute over the last few years has looked at how this has played out. What were the specific mechanisms that were used to build racism into our housing systems over the course of history? Using that as a jumping off point to then answer the question of what can we do? So this is a timeline that we put together looking at the different mechanisms that we identified, and specifically focusing on mechanisms that were implemented and perpetuated at the local level. There's a lot to be said about what happened through policy at the federal level, but when we dug into this research, we felt like there was really something missing about the local history that we wanted to uplift. So that's what the focus of my talk is here. And when we map them out on the timeline like this, you see how they all sort of overlap at different points in time. And some dropped off because, for example, explicitly racial zoning became illegal, but then it kind of evolved into other forms of implicitly racial zoning. And all of these different tactics were in ways interwoven with each other, and they adapted as court rulings and policies sought to limit discrimination. And what that says to me is that this push for exclusion was really incredibly persistent. And it's one side of two stories here. So there's the advancement towards justice and activism through advocacy, and then those were followed by efforts to undermine and then circumvent those wins. And so while we've made progress, really amazing progress, we also still have yet to effectively repair the history. And by the time that the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968 at the federal level, and housing discrimination was outlawed through that law, structural racism and inequality were already firmly entrenched. And so that continues to shape what we see today. And what else I think that this highlights is that there are multiple actors and institutions that are involved or were involved in perpetuating harm, and that now hold responsibility for repair. I think this quote from a scholar, Kianga Yamada Taylor, really speaks to the nuances of this. She says that the problems are not just about the federal government or real estate or banking. It's about their relationship, the ways the private sector influences the direction of public policy. And I think it's blurry. The boundary between public and private are blurred because they're so intertwined. And I would say, to add to what she says here, that local governments also hold a responsibility. And historically, cities haven't always owned their responsibility to addressing historic harms and advancing repair. And that's one area where I think a lot is possible, especially if we're talking about like what can we do in a more immediate sense that's a little bit more graspable than like federal policy change. And so that's where I personally like to focus my energy, is on local and regional issues. And I wanted to share one story that's local to the South Bay that kind of highlights this relationship between public institutions and private action, and speaks to how different mechanisms of exclusion were intertwined. And so this, if you look at our report, it happens to be the first story that the report opens with, and it's about the Sheng family, who was originally living in San Francisco's Chinatown. They were looking to move to South San Francisco, to a subdivision called Southwood. They had signed a purchase agreement, were already set to move in. And when white neighbors learned that a Chinese American family planned to move in, they protested the purchase, and the city manager was also a homeowner in that neighborhood. And he orchestrated a community meeting in which the Sheng family was confronted by 75 white homeowners opposed to his family moving into the neighborhood. And the conversation was that we don't have any personal animosity toward you, but their fear was over their property values, and that they would decrease and the neighborhood would lose its status as being a restricted white only neighborhood if the Sheng family moved in. And to layer onto this, the Southwood Subdivision's builder, which is a company called American Homes Development Company, had stoked this fear among homeowners. They sent a letter that urged them to protect their private property rights and the original restricted covenants, even though this was already at the point where restrictive covenants were illegal. The company reportedly attempted to intimidate the person who was selling the home to the Sheng family. And that homeowner was saying that the developers were telling them that the whole neighborhood would sue them, and that would, blackball his business, that would bring, personal ruin to him. And so what they did was have a neighborhood vote on this question of whether the Sheng family purchase can go through. And the city paid for and printed the ballots to vote on that. And the result was that the Southwood neighborhood voted to exclude the Shengs, 174 votes to 28 votes. And so I think what this speaks to is, yes, this is a story of individual action, but it was really through institutional power of the city and the real estate industry that mobilized for racial exclusion and the protection of wealth. And this sort of exclusion, I would say, is a form of dispossession, which is a form of state violence that was also furthered through the actions of private citizens driven by their private interests. And one thing to highlight is that this occurrence of dispossession was a constant part of the region's story. And I won't spend too much time on this because Cecilia covered this really well, but when we're talking about dispossession, I'm talking about things like forced removal from land and housing through colonization and the dispossession of indigenous folks, the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, urban renewal, in which governments used eminent domain to force people out of their property when their neighborhoods were deemed blighted, as well as racialized rights to property ownership, which Cecilia spoke a lot about, and then also police enforced containment to certain areas and neighborhoods. And those forms of state violence also went hand in hand with extrajudicial violence, and that in of itself is a blurry line between one and the other, because this sort of violence that was enacted by individuals or groups outside of the government also was enabled by the government. It wasn't something that police or prosecutors or courts pushed back on. And this includes things like arson, assault, lynching, and threats of violence. Cities throughout the Bay Area were known as sundown towns, which were like formal public threats is, I guess, the best way to describe it, where it was known that if you were a person of color, you shouldn't be in this city once the sun goes down. And so now I want to turn, oh, actually, I'll pause there for a second and see if there are any questions.
Nicole, while people are thinking of their questions, there was another question in the chat from earlier asking about the nexus for farm worker housing. And I think it was maybe in relationship to one of the earlier maps you showed with displacement and gentrification.
That's a good question. I will say I haven't examined that closely, so I don't have an answer, but it's definitely something that I can look into and follow up with if that would be helpful. Yeah, I apologize. All right, I will jump to the next section. And I want to turn now to some of the specific mechanisms that were used to create segregated neighborhoods and cities. And here again, I want to talk about how these both involved the intertwining of public policy and private action. And I already mentioned a couple times, I think, racial covenants. And so just to define that term, these were clauses in contracts and property deeds that forbid the sale and sometimes rental of property to non-white people. And in the early 1900s, they were specifically used to target particularly Asian Americans and African Americans. And they were deemed illegal and unenforceable in 1948 with the federal court case. But neighborhoods around the country found other ways to keep people of color out of neighborhoods and to bar them from purchasing property. And so one of the ways that happened was they would create racial exclusion clauses in community associations in which potential buyers would have to become members before purchasing the property in the area. And so these were private covenants, not rather than public policy. And here was, here's an example from development in the East Bay, the Claremont neighborhood of Berkeley and Oakland. And so you can see the language here where it says that no part of said lands, blah, blah, should ever be used or occupied by any person or persons of other than pure Caucasian blood. And then it says if the only way that someone of not pure Caucasian blood could live there is if they are employees of someone who is of that ancestry. And so these were very common and widespread throughout properties in the Bay Area at the time. And here's another snapshot. This is from an ad that was in a newspaper that you can see. It's for Rockridge Park. It's framing it as the most desirable place for a permanent home. And one of the features it names is that no Negroes, no Chinese, no Japanese can build or lease in Rockridge Park. And then similar in this other ad, it mentions specifically no flat stores or apartments, which are the type of housing that would be more affordable to lower income people of color. And then also specifically no Asiatics or Africans. And so I mentioned those racial covenants and bylaws, those were private sector rules, but then they were paired with exclusionary zoning, which was public policy. And exclusionary zoning made it harder or impossible to build housing that would be more affordable and accessible to lower income people of color. And so just to define zoning, zoning delineates what land uses are legal and where those limits apply. And zoning is basically what we know of as land use policy today in the US. And exclusionary zoning often involves limiting or prohibiting apartments or multifamily housing in a way that, in naming it in that way, made it so that zoning ordinances were colorblind or race neutral, but they had the impact and the intent of excluding based on race. And with the rise of exclusionary zoning, we also saw again the influence of the private sector, because the rise of exclusionary zoning came at the time when the real estate industry was really becoming professionalized, and it sought to exert its control and power over the built environment beyond what developers could control through racial covenants. And so that was when we saw the creation of the National Association of Real Estate Boards that really lobbied for zoning to be adopted in cities throughout the country. And the emphasis was really on property values. This is a quote from Jessica Traunstein. As zoning practices spread through the 1920s, emphasis on the enhancement of property values became the dominant argument. And it was believed that the wrong sorts of people residing or even working in an area could negatively impact property values. And that was coded language for people of color, working class, and low-income people. And specifically, often the framing was around apartment houses being the thing that would really condemn property values, whereas single-family dwellings were what was lifted up as the ideal that needed to be protected. And so at the time when zoning became a legitimate power of municipalities through that lobbying that I mentioned during the 1910s and 20s, it became a driving force behind most suburban incorporation campaigns. So that's when we saw a lot of new cities establish themselves, and it provided suburbs with a means to separate themselves jurisdictionally from populations that were seen as socially and even racially suspect. And so this was what is commonly known as white flight, when we saw large proportions of white populations moving out of larger cities and into more newly established suburbs. And so just to look at an example of a zoning ordinance, this is the Berkeley zoning ordinance from 1916 that first created an exclusive single-family residential zoning designation. And you could see it created this district of class 1 that meant in these areas only single-family zoning could be built. And that was the first city that did it, and now it's pretty much standard use throughout the US, although we're starting to see challenges around that. And even though it doesn't mention race in the law itself, it was celebrated by California Real Estate magazine for its protection against invasion of Negroes and Asiatics. So the intent was pretty clear from the start that this was about racial exclusion. And aside from exclusive single family zoning, there were other sorts of zoning tools that were used. One that is popular or was popular in the South Bay was specifying minimum lot sizes. So for example, Atherton and Los Altos Hills, when they were established as cities, they created a 1 acre minimum for houses to be built on. So a single family house had to be on 1 acre, meaning that that would be pretty expensive because that is a really large piece of land. And oops. And then so going back to the real estate industry, at the same time, as we saw a rise of larger scale development, realtors began to have a more dominant hand in transactions and sales of land. And the industry was really becoming a professionalized entity. And even after racial covenants were outlawed, real estate practices basically kept them enforced. So for at least 25 years following its release, there was this National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics that provides guidance on the practice of realtors, real estate transactions. And it says, a realtor should never be instrumental in introducing into a neighborhood a character of property or occupancy, members of any race or nationality, or any individuals whose presence will be clearly detrimental to property values in that neighborhood, which is speaking to the importance of maintaining white segregation and exclusion. And so that was kind of the industry standard, the ethical standard of the industry. And so this played out in a few different ways. And probably familiar with these terms: steering, racial steering, or the practice of guiding prospective homebuyers toward or away from certain neighborhoods based on their race. So for example, in the Bay Area, it was common for local realty boards to have an unofficial agreement to not show property to Black potential homebuyers. They would also artificially raise prices for Black prospective buyers, or lie about the availability of property in order to maintain exclusivity in certain neighborhoods. And it was not simple to just challenge those rules. If you stepped out of line as a realtor, your career would be over. And then another common practice was blockbusting, which is the practice of provoking fear or racial change in the neighborhood in order to profit from the transactions of white people selling and people of color buying. So one example of that is in East Palo Alto and other areas, real estate agents would stir up fear in white homeowners and say that more and more Black people are moving into this community, and they would capitalize on that. They would leave pamphlets on white families' doors forecasting the collapse of real estate values, and then agents would give African Americans free bus rides through East Palo Alto's neighborhoods to encourage Black families to buy there, while attempting to scare white homeowners into selling. And then these same agents would assist these white families in finding housing in new subdivisions in other cities, while then offering assistance to incoming African American families. And so in this way, they received commission on both ends of those transactions. And so all of these different tactics that I was describing, racial covenants, zoning, real estate practices, and all backed by different forms of violence, were really mutually reinforcing. And I think these tactics speak to the deep linkages between the real estate industry and government that made the market-driven system of housing today that sort of really limits the political possibility of anything else. And systemic racism is really built into the system of capitalism. And so I think this quote is really powerful from Destin Jenkins. He says, segregation is the domestic expression of racial capitalism in the 20th century, government as the vehicle and real estate industry in the driver's seat. And the historical record really speaks to that. It reveals how the real estate industry, which is comprised of agents, developers, builders, landlords, and investors, really served as a major organizing force for and a beneficiary of many of the tactics of racial exclusion and dispossession throughout the 20th century. And beyond asserting their direct control over discrimination in the private market through racial covenants, steering, and blockbusting, real estate industry leaders really exerted political control over state and local government, holding elected office or appointed office in order to deliberately advance a policy agenda that protected and served their financial interests. And so I don't want to end there, just because it's also important to, to talk about how just as these mechanisms of exclusion persisted, so has the fight against them. And so in researching this history of exclusion, we also found inspiring stories of activism and resistance. And I wanted to share just one key case, which was from Silicon Valley, a story of the case James versus Valtierra in the 1970s, where Anita Valtierra, who was a mother in San Jose, a working class mother, brought a lawsuit challenging Article 34 of the California Constitution, which was adopted only a few decades before by a statewide vote, which requires the construction of all publicly funded low-income housing developments to be subject to a referendum or a vote by the people in that municipality on whether or not that housing development can go forward and be built. And they argued that it violates the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment by discriminating on the basis of class. And this was a really key effort. They weren't successful in the lawsuit, but it was a really key effort in establishing or asserting the right to housing for working class people in the communities that they're from. And this is a fight that goes on today. And I wanted to note, so Article 34 still exists, but there is a vote that'll happen in March 2024, a constitutional amendment to repeal Article 34. So there's a chance that that policy will change in the near future. And I will note that the vote to repeal it is being sponsored by the real estate industry. So there has been a change in the real estate industry realizing the harm that it has done in the past and how it's seeking to repair that harm. And I also just wanted to highlight some promising models and efforts to build new structures and challenge the way that history has baked in exclusion and marginalization into our systems. And this is an example of partnership between community land trusts and local government. I wanted to share a couple examples. They're not from the Bay Area, they're both from Orange County, but one is a project that's being developed by a community land trust called Thrive Santa Ana. And they're creating a micro farm on a plot of public land that's owned by the city. And they were they worked with the city to acquire this land. The city donated it to them, and worked with residents to then develop a vision for the site, and came up with a plan for a space for farming, sale of locally produced foods and crafts, community space for events and gatherings, farmers markets, and a space for selling products from local vendors and cooperatives. And another example of a community land trust in Irvine working with the city to use public land for the building of permanently affordable housing. And they were able to leverage public land to build over 500 units of affordable housing over the years. And the city continues to provide them with financial support in the form of low interest and long-term loans for rental projects, which can be renewed and extended, and in some cases forgiven. So I think these examples of partnership between local government and community speak to a different way of operating from the past, and really challenging the commodification of land in a way that allows us to use public land for public good rather than private gain, and shift toward caring for residents who are most impacted by housing unaffordability through land uses and governance models that really advance community self-determination. And I wanted to lift these up, even though they're not based in the Bay Area, because at the same time, there is a growing community land trust movement in the Bay. There's the South Bay CLT and other emerging efforts, others that have been around for longer that include the San Francisco CLT, Oakland CLT, and Bay Area CLT. But there is a lot going on in this space in terms of public policy to advance collective ownership models that really support affordable housing, and that can be used for other uses beyond affordable housing, like with this example from Thrive Santana with the micro farm. And so I will conclude there and see if there are any questions that I can answer before we wrap up.
Thanks, Nicole. And yeah, maybe as folks are sort of getting their questions together, I'll ask you one. So I think you've alluded to one sort of potential policy opportunity, but I know that this is also an area where there's a ton of active work. So wanting to know if there are other sort of particular policies or opportunities for advocacy, if folks want to take action on this topic, where should they look?
Yeah, I think the place to start is to look and see what conversations are happening around affordable housing in your community at city councils, when affordable housing projects are being proposed, coming out in support of them, but also not just thinking about creating new affordable housing, thinking about work around advancing protections for tenants. And that's where a lot of my work sits, and addressing this power imbalance between renters versus property owners. And there are ongoing movements around that as well. I think it really varies from city to city, because different cities are in different places in terms of policies that they've already adopted. But there are firmly established movements in a lot of parts of the South Bay. So if you're interested, I think you could look into organizations like Silicon Valley at Home in San Mateo. There's the Housing Leadership Council. There's also groups like Sacred Heart Community Services, which I know is represented on this call and does a lot of amazing work around housing affordability, both in terms of production as well as protections and preserving affordable housing that already exists. And so I'd say get connected to organizations that are doing really amazing work locally.
Great. And there is a question in the chat. How did these practices affect rental housing in the area? Were people restricted in similar ways?
Yeah, it was similar. Same sort of the covenants would apply, not just for home ownership, but in renting. And so often what choices there were for renters were just extremely limited to segregated communities, and even less than what would be available to homeowners.
Great. Any other questions for Nicole? Otherwise, Nicole, I'll notice that people were very excited about the maps that you were sharing in the beginning. So thank you so much for bringing those great resources to us in addition to your presentation on your report.
Thanks. Yeah.
All right. Well, we will shift over to closing. And so I will say a big thank you to you all for hanging in through 2 pretty packed hours of content. I think we all, there was much to learn and we learned it all. So I will just close by sharing what's coming next. So we have 3 more sessions. Next month will be focused on food, culture, and power with a panel discussion. In April, we'll bring you some examples of community-led approaches to food work. And then in May, we plan to close with our in-person gathering at the Stanford Educational Farm. And with that, I think the link to the evaluation survey is in the chat, and we really are taking quite seriously what the feedback you provide in that survey. So we encourage you to let us know what's working and what's not working, so we can adjust our course as we make our way through the next few sessions. And otherwise, we'll just say thank you again for joining us today, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great content. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. I just wanted to say great work again on the webinar.